Hi, welcome to our channel. You've joined us in the past few weeks. We are going through the New Testament just in the means of giving you the background to what is going on in these ancient documents. One of the biggest mistakes that people make is they pick up the New Testament and they read it with an idea of, what does this mean to me? Now, there's a time and place for that. But we need to stay close to what it originally meant, or we can take the wrong lessons from it. And especially true in the book of Galatians. Now you might be asking, why are we starting with Galatians? Romans happens before Galatians, so does 1st and 2nd Corinthians. But I kind of want to take the Pauline letters chronologically, and the very first one is Galatians. In fact, the first book of the New Testament chronologically is Galatians. In our biography of Paul last week, if you didn't hear it, go back and pick it up and listen to it. We talked about the life of Paul, and he had his experience on the Damascus Road. We didn't really call it a conversion. We didn't think that was the right word, but maybe a complete reorientation. And then he spent about 12 to 15 years in obscurity. Think about it. He was no longer welcome with the Jewish ruling council. He had made a decisive break when he decided that Jesus was the Messiah. And he also wasn't trusted by the churches. Nothing wrong with them. You wouldn't have trusted them either. Paul had made life difficult for Christians for a couple of years, and now that all of a sudden he is one, you can understand why people might have been a little reticent about welcoming him into their fellowship. Now it's 13 years later. It's 47 or 48 AD. Paul, still not really trusted, not really welcome in Jerusalem. He is sent by the church in Antioch, and he goes up into modern-day Turkey to a region called Galatia. Galatia is in modern-day Turkey, and he starts churches there. And Paul went up, and whenever Paul went to a brand new area, he preached a sermon straight out of Genesis chapter 15. And the main part of that was Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Simple faith, simple trust in Jesus Christ. Gentiles responded to the message. And Paul started his church in Galatia, and a few months later, he moved on. And then maybe, we don't know, 4 months, 3 months, 6 months later, a group of people from the church in Jerusalem come up to see what Paul has done in Galatia. And they hit Paul's churches, and they preach a different message. It's a little bit the same. It starts off the same way. Hey, Paul's a great guy, and yes, it's true that faith in Christ is decisive, but, and it's a big but, Paul didn't go as far as he should have. Genesis 17 says, every male among you must be circumcised. It is an argument between what Paul says from Genesis 17 and the church in Jerusalem says out of Genesis 17. Now, the people in Galatia were so committed, so zealous. We want to be sure that we do everything we can to stay in this faith, that they lined up and as adults willingly went for adult circumcision. Now, here's the thing. We'll talk about the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians later. But in Corinth, my goodness, you had Christians suing other Christians. You had women who had decided not to touch their husbands. You had husbands who were at the fertility temples having sex with temple prostitutes. And Paul never once stopped calling them Christian. Paul writes this letter to Galatia, where people were so zealous, so committed, that they volunteered to undergo adult circumcision, and Paul says, you've lost the faith. Think about that just for a second. Here's another mistake that we make. We think that the issue Paul is dealing with in Galatia is that people were trying to earn their salvation. They were earning status before God. That is simply not correct, and here's basically why. There's not a Jew alive in the first century who would have believed that they had to earn their status. Their status was because God chose them. They're the chosen people. Some of you remember the musical Fiddler on the Roof, where Tevye says, I know we're your chosen people, but sometimes I wish you'd chosen someone else. That's how they felt. Jews were simply chosen. There was nothing they could do. All they could do was ruin their status by being unfaithful. So a Jew did not do these things in order to earn status or earn salvation. They simply had it. They did it in order to keep that status, keep the land they were in. And we even see this when we get to chapter 2. Paul is, early in chapter 2, is in the middle of his account of his argument with Peter. If you remember, Paul describes a scene where Peter has joined him in Galatia. They are sitting down at a long table. They're eating with the Gentile believers. There's an old movie where Anthony Hopkins plays Paul, and I forget who played Peter, and they're sitting at a table, and there's a barbecued pig on the table in front of them, and Paul and Peter they're discussing their next part of their journey. And someone says, Paul, men from James, men from Jerusalem have come and want to talk to you. And Peter jumps up from the table. He doesn't want to be seen eating what the Gentiles eat, sitting at the same table with the Gentiles. Paul then confronts him angrily, calls him a hypocrite. Wait a minute, you just ate what they do. Now you're pulling back. Why are you pulling back? Is the family of God decided on faith? On trust? Or is the family of God determined by whether you're circumcised or not? By whether you eat pork or not? And so that's the issue. And Paul starts off in Galatians 2, and he says, we know. He says we. This is the point of agreement between himself and even these Jewish Christians from Jerusalem. We know that a man is not justified by the works of the law. Not by works, not by good deeds. Works of the law was a technical phrase in the first century that meant all the things that a Jew did to mark themselves off as a Jew. So, avoiding pork, avoiding shellfish, avoiding meat that's been cooked in the milk of its own mother. Therefore, like a bacon double cheeseburger, that's 2 food laws in one sandwich. You have the bacon, that's the pork, you have the meat and the cheese together. You couldn't do that. Also circumcision, observing the special holidays. You're justified not by observing these technical markers, but through the next question is what the next phrase is. Your translation probably says through faith in Christ. It probably should read faith, the faithfulness of Christ. That he was faithful, went to the cross on our behalf, rose again. You're justified not by these markers that you do, but through the faithfulness of Christ. Now, every generation of Christians has to fight the same battle. What is vital and what is extraneous to the Christian faith? I don't know about you, but the church I grew up in, I know I'm starting to sound like an old man, 50-some years ago. Small town in Ohio. You could kind of tell who our tribe was by how they dressed. And some of you remember those days. And sometimes we think there have been groups through time that have said, no, this is the dress, this is the period of time that reflects Jesus Christ. So there's still groups in the country today where women don't wear pants, or men can't wear jeans, or a hairstyle, women can't cut their hair, or has to be worn in a bun, or there's all kind of things. Certain colors must be worn. Think of the Amish, no buttons. Has to be certain colors. This is a similar battle to what's going on back then. Paul's argument was, wait a minute, Jews are free to do all of that stuff, but we cannot force Gentiles. The standard has always been the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Anytime you say plus anything else, plus circumcision, plus a clothing style, plus the food you eat, Christianity is no longer simply about the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. It ceases to be about the central focus of what we have said it has been for 2,000 years. Our task as believers is to be sure that our Christian faith is about that simple trust, simple faith, not only that Jesus Christ is God, but that he died and rose again. Anything else is on the periphery. And I think we always need to remember that. The other thing that we always need to remember about Galatians is we're not quite sure what the issue was between Paul and the Jewish Christians. Here's what I mean. Is the issue that the Gentiles were not doing what the Jews were doing? Or is the issue that Paul was saying that even the Jews didn't have to do what the Jews had been doing through the years? Or was the issue that they were mad at Paul because Paul was a Jew and himself were now doing what the Gentiles do? I mean, eating pork, eating shellfish. So we're not sure exactly what the point of contention. We know the issue, but we know exactly what the point of contention was back then. And so Paul's main focus in Galatians is simply to say, try to get these Gentiles, the Galatians were Gentiles, who were doing what the Jews demanded them to do. Now, here's where it breaks down for us. Some of us grew up in a different place in a different time. Some of us grew up in a place, maybe we're only comfortable wearing a certain kind of clothes. We're not comfortable doing this. We're not comfortable listening to that. We're not comfortable with a whole host of things. I think Paul would tell us, go ahead with whatever your comfort level is. Feel free to avoid those things. But be careful what you require other people to do. Because you just might be enforcing on them a peripheral issue and not the central focus. I have a nightmare that I dream occasionally. It's some 20 years in the future, and I go to a church, and the church is reaching people, and the service starts, and the entire service is done with hip-hop music. I hope I have the maturity to not be too bothered by periphery. Maybe I'll buy earplugs or something, or noise-canceling headphones through that part of the service. But that's a periphery kind of thing, as long as the central claim is the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you go back and read through Galatians, that's what the whole thing Paul's talking about. What is the central focus there? So anyway, as we've gone through, just talk a little bit about exactly the crisis point in the book of Galatians. Hope it helps your understanding. Join us each week. Please ask us a question. If you think we got something wrong, ask for a point of clarification. Put it in the comments section. I guarantee we'll get back to it and we'll answer it or try to answer it next week. Subscribe to it. Like us. But anyway, we'll see you again next week, same time.